That single note hung in the air like a question, waiting for an answer. David froze, his cleaning cloth still in his hand, staring down at the key his finger had barely touched. Middle C. The most basic note on the piano. The starting point for every beginner. The note that had begun his own musical journey 20 years ago. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. It was just one note, but it carried the weight of everything he'd lost, everything he'd given up, everything he'd pushed down and buried under bills and responsibilities and the desperate need to just survive each day. David looked around the empty theater as if someone might suddenly appear and catch him doing something wrong. But the red velvet seats stared back at him silently. The stage lights cast long shadows across the wooden floor. He was completely alone. His finger was still resting on middle C. Without thinking, he pressed it again. The note rang out clearer. This time, more confident. It echoed off the theater walls and came back to him like an old friend saying hello after a long absence. His left hand joined his right, finding its way to the lower keys. F below middle C, then A, then back to C. A simple chord, nothing fancy. But his hands remembered how to shape it, how to hold it, how to let the notes blend together into something bigger than the sum of their parts. The sound filled the empty theater, and for the first time in 2 years, David felt something crack, open inside his chest. Not break, not shatter. Just crack, like ice beginning to thaw after a long winter. He pulled his hands back and looked at them. These hands that loaded trucks and emptied trash cans and tied shoelaces and wiped away tears. These hands that had once made music every single day. They were rougher now, with calluses in different places. But they still knew where to go. David glanced toward the theater exits one more time. Still empty, still quiet, except for the gentle hum of the ventilation system and the distant sound of traffic outside. What would it hurt? Just for a minute. Just to see if he still remembered. He sat down on the piano bench properly this time, adjusting the height the way he'd been taught in college. Back straight but not stiff, shoulders relaxed, wrists up, feet flat on the floor. His body fell into the posture like it had been waiting all this time. His right hand found a simple melody. Nothing complicated, just a basic scale, walking up from C to the C above it. His fingers moved slowly at first, remembering the spacing between keys, the weight needed for each note. But muscle memory is a powerful thing. Within moments, his fingers were dancing across the keys like they'd never stopped. The scale became a simple tune, nothing he'd learned from sheet music, just something that came from inside him, flowing from his heart through his arms to his fingertips. It was gentle and sad and beautiful all at once. As he played, memories started flooding back. He remembered being 7 years old, sitting next to his grandmother at her old upright piano, her wrinkled hands guiding his small fingers to the right keys. Music isn't about being perfect, she'd told him. It's about saying what your heart can't find words for. He remembered high school talent shows where he'd played for audiences, of teenagers who were more interested in their phones than his performance. But there was always that one moment, that one song, where everyone would go quiet and actually listen. He remembered college recitals where he'd worn his best suit and played pieces by Bach and Mozart and Chopin. The way applause felt like warm rain after those performances, the way his professor would nod approvingly from the back of the concert hall. Most of all, he remembered playing for Anna. Their first date, he'd been too nervous to eat dinner. So, instead, he'd taken her to the music building on campus late one evening when the practice rooms were empty. He'd played for her then, some romantic piece he thought would impress her. But she'd asked him to play something he loved, not something he thought she wanted to hear, so he'd played a jazz standard his grandmother had taught him, something with a swinging rhythm that made you want to move your shoulders and tap your feet. Anna had started dancing right there in that tiny practice room, and he'd fallen in love with her before the song was even over. Later, when they were married, he'd play while she cooked dinner. She'd hum along, making up words when she didn't know the real ones. Sunday mornings were the best. He'd play gentle, lazy melodies while she made pancakes, and the whole house would smell like breakfast and sound like contentment. When Lucy was a baby, she'd cry every night around 8 o'clock. Nothing would calm her down until David started, playing soft lullabies. She'd stop crying almost immediately, like the music was exactly what she'd been asking for. Tommy had been the same way. Music was like a magic sleeping potion for both of them. Even during Anna's illness, music had been their constant companion. When she was too tired to talk, David would play her favorite songs. When the treatments made her feel sick, he'd play gentle melodies that seemed to ease her discomfort. The last song he'd ever played for her was Clair de Lune by Claude Debussy. She'd smiled when he started, even though she could barely keep her eyes open. "Play it again," she'd whispered when he finished. So he had. Over and over until she fell asleep for the last time. Now, sitting in this empty theater, David's hands found their way to that same piece. Clair de Lune. Moonlight. The most beautiful, heartbreaking piece of music ever written. His fingers moved across the keys like they were telling a story only they knew how to tell. The first notes were like stepping into a dream, soft and mysterious and full of longing. David had played this piece hundreds of times, but tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt like he was playing it for Anna one more time, like she was sitting in one of those red velvet seats, listening and smiling the way she used to. As the melody developed, David felt tears starting to build behind his eyes. But they weren't sad tears. Not exactly. They were the kind of tears that come when something beautiful touches a part of your soul you'd forgotten existed. His left hand joined in with the gentle rolling accompaniment that made the piece sound, like water flowing over stones. The theater's acoustics were perfect for this kind of music. Every note rang clear and pure, hanging in the air before blending with the next one. David let himself get lost in the music. For the first time in 2 years, he wasn't thinking about bills or schedules or whether the kids had finished their homework. He wasn't worrying about money or wondering if he was doing enough as a father. He was just playing. The piece built to its gentle climax, where the melody soars above the accompaniment like a bird learning to fly. David's right hand danced across the higher keys, while his left hand provided the steady, comforting foundation below. This was the part Anna had loved most. She'd always close her eyes and get a dreamy look on her face when he reached this section. As the music began to wind down, returning to those soft, mysterious opening notes, David realized he was crying, not sobbing, not breaking down. Just letting tears fall silently down his cheeks, while his hands continued their dance across the keys. The final notes of Clair de Lune faded into silence. David sat with his hands resting on the keys, feeling like he'd just had a conversation with someone he'd missed desperately. The emptiness in his chest that had been there for 2 years felt different somehow. Still there, but not as sharp. Not as overwhelming. He took a shaky breath and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. What was he doing? He had work to finish. Floors to mop, trash to empty, surfaces to clean. He couldn't just sit here playing piano like some teenager skipping chores, but his hands didn't want to leave the keys. Before he could stop himself, he started playing again. This time it was something more upbeat. A jazz standard his grandmother had taught him. Something with a bouncing rhythm that made you want to smile. His fingers moved with more confidence now, remembering runs and chords he thought he'd forgotten. The music filled the theater with warmth and energy. If Anna could hear this, she'd be dancing. She'd be spinning around in that way she did when she was happy, her hair flying out around her like she was in a movie. David found himself smiling as he played, actually smiling. When was the last time music had made him smile instead of cry? He moved from the jazz standard into a classical piece he'd learned in college, then into a modern song he'd figured out by ear years ago. His hands were remembering everything: scales and arpeggios, chord progressions, and melodic lines. It was like finding a box of treasures he'd forgotten he owned. For 20 minutes, David played everything he could remember: fast pieces and slow pieces, happy songs and sad songs, simple melodies and complex arrangements. He played until his hands were tired and his heart was full, and the empty theater felt like the most perfect place on earth. Finally, he stopped. The silence that followed felt different than the silence before. Not empty and lonely, but full of possibility. Full of music that was still echoing in his memory even though the notes had faded. David looked at his hands resting on the keys. Then he looked out at the empty theater, at the red seats and golden trim and the stage lights that had witnessed his private concert. "Thank you," he whispered to the piano, to the theater, to Anna, to whatever force in the universe had guided his hands back to these keys tonight. He stood up from the bench and picked up his cleaning cloth. Work wasn't finished, but something else had begun. The alarm clock screamed at 5:30 a.m. just like it had every morning for the past 2 years. David rolled over and hit the snooze button with a tired hand. 5 more minutes. That's all he needed. Just 5 more minutes before the chaos began. But chaos doesn't wait for anyone, especially not single fathers. "Dad, I can't find my school shoes." 8-year-old Lucy's voice echoed from the hallway. Before David could even sit up in bed, 6-year-old Tommy was already bouncing on his mattress like it was a trampoline. "Dad, Dad, Dad, can we have pancakes, please, please, please?" David looked at his 2 children and smiled, even though exhaustion was pulling at every muscle in his body. These were his reasons for everything. These 2 little faces that looked so much like their mother. The same bright eyes, the same stubborn chin, the same way of making his heart feel full and broken at the same time. Shoes are by the front. "Door, sweetheart," he called out to Lucy while gently moving Tommy off his chest. "And buddy, we're having cereal again today. Pancakes are for weekends, remember?" Tommy's face fell for exactly 3 seconds before he bounced back with the resilience only children possess. "Can I pick the cereal?" Sure thing. This was life now. Had been for 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days. Not that he was counting. Okay, maybe he was counting a little bit. David's wife had been gone for over 2 years now. Cancer took her away when Lucy was 6 and Tommy was 4. The kids barely remembered those final months in the hospital, and David was grateful for that. Children shouldn't have to carry those heavy memories. But David remembered everything. The way she'd made morning routines look effortless. How she could pack lunchboxes while braiding Lucy's hair and somehow still have time to kiss everyone goodbye. She had been the music in their house, literally and figuratively. Always humming something while she cooked. Always finding reasons to dance in the kitchen. Now mornings felt like military operations. David had gotten good at it, but it was nothing like the warm, musical mornings they used to have. He worked. 3 jobs to keep their little family afloat. During the day, he loaded trucks at a shipping warehouse. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady, and his supervisor understood when he needed to leave early for school events. After the warehouse, he'd pick up the kids, help with homework, make dinner, and get them ready for bed. Then, when most parents were settling down to watch TV or read a book, David would put on his second uniform, a simple gray jumpsuit with his name stitched on the pocket. Time for job number 2. 3 nights a week he cleaned office buildings downtown, emptying trash cans, vacuuming carpets, wiping down conference tables where important people made important decisions. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills. Well, most of them anyway, but Thursday and Friday nights were different. Those nights, he worked at the Riverside Community Theater. The theater was beautiful. Really beautiful. It wasn't some grand opera house like you see in movies, but it had character. Red velvet seats, golden trim that caught the light just right, and a stage that had seen decades of dreams come to life. Local productions, school plays, charity events, and sometimes even traveling shows would grace that stage. David's job was simple. After every show or rehearsal, he'd clean up, sweep the stage, mop the floors, wipe down the seats, and make sure everything was perfect for the next performance. The work was peaceful in a way his other jobs weren't. No rushing, no heavy lifting, just him and the quiet theater. The best part was the piano. Right in the center of the stage sat a beautiful black Steinway grand piano. Even when David was just mopping around it, he'd find himself staring at those keys. 88 perfect black and white rectangles that held infinite possibilities. David used to play. Back in college, before life became about paychecks and health insurance and parent-teacher conferences. He'd been good too, really good. His professor had even suggested he consider music as a career, maybe become a teacher or perform professionally. But then he met Anna, fell in love, got married, and music became something he did for fun on weekends. When the kids were born, the piano in their living room became a place to stack mail and hold family photos. Still, sometimes late at night, he'd sit down and play quietly, just for himself. When Anna got sick, medical bills started piling up. Insurance covered some things, but not everything. Not the experimental treatments they hoped might help. Not the special medications that cost more per month than most people's rent. Definitely not the extra months in the hospital when things got really bad. The piano had to go. David sold it to help pay for Anna's final month of care. He'd told himself it was just a piano, just wood and strings and metal. But when the buyers came to take it away, he'd locked himself in the bathroom and cried like a child. That was 18 months ago, and he hadn't touched a piano since. But now, 3 nights a week, he found himself alone with this beautiful instrument. Sometimes, when he was wiping dust from its bench or polishing its surface, his fingers would hover over the keys. He never pressed down, never made a sound, but his hands remembered. They remembered Chopin's gentle nocturnes that used to help Baby Lucy fall asleep. They remembered the jazz standards he'd play on Sunday mornings while Anna made breakfast. They remembered the last song he'd played for her in the hospital room, when she was too weak to talk, but still smiled when he hummed along. The kids didn't know their father had ever played piano. After Anna died, David had packed away everything, musical in their house. Sheet music, CDs, even the little keyboard toy Tommy used to bang on. It hurt too much to hear music without her. The house became quieter, more practical. No more dancing in the kitchen, no more humming while doing chores. David told himself this was better. Music was a luxury he couldn't afford, emotionally or financially. His children needed a father who could provide for them, not one lost in melodies and memories. But every Thursday and Friday night when he was alone in that theater, something inside him ached. The piano seemed to call to him, asking why he never said hello anymore. Why he treated it like furniture instead of the magical thing it really was. Tonight was Thursday. David had picked up the kids from after-school care, helped Lucy with her math homework, and listened to Tommy read aloud from his picture book about dinosaurs. They'd eaten spaghetti with store-brand sauce, watched one episode of their favorite cartoon, and gone through the bedtime routine that had become second nature. Mrs. Rodriguez from next door had arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, just like she did, every Thursday and Friday. She was a grandmother whose own grandchildren lived far away, and she seemed to genuinely enjoy spending time with Lucy and Tommy. They'd play board games or watch movies until David got home around midnight. Now David stood outside the theater, key in hand, looking up at the old building. The marquee announced next week's charity gala, some fancy fundraiser for the local children's hospital. He'd be cleaning up after their dress rehearsals all week. He unlocked the door and stepped into the quiet lobby. The theater always smelled, like old wood and fresh flowers. Tonight, someone had left a bouquet of roses on the information desk, probably left over from whatever they'd been rehearsing. David made his way into the main theater and flipped on the work lights. The stage looked bigger when it was empty, like a blank canvas waiting for someone to fill it with stories. His cleaning supplies were right where he'd left them in the supply closet backstage. He started with the seats, working row by row, wiping, down armrests and picking up forgotten programs. The work was meditative. No one to talk to, no children asking questions, no deadlines to meet. Just the simple satisfaction of making something clean and perfect. As he worked, David found himself humming. He didn't realize he was doing it at first, but there it was, a melody floating out of him like it had been waiting all day to escape. It was something Anna used to love, though he couldn't remember the name. She'd hum it while folding laundry or washing dishes. When he finished the seats, David moved to the stage. This was always his favorite part. Up here, under the lights, he could pretend he was someone else. Someone who hadn't lost his wife. Someone who didn't work 3 jobs. Someone who still had music in his life. The piano sat in the center of the stage like a sleeping giant. David approached it carefully, almost respectfully. He'd cleaned around it hundreds of times, but tonight felt different somehow. Maybe it was the humming, or maybe it was just the weight of another long day. But something was stirring inside him. He pulled out his polishing cloth and began wiping down the piano's surface. The wood was so deep and rich, like dark chocolate. His reflection looked back at him from its polished surface, distorted and wavering like a funhouse mirror. As he cleaned, his hand accidentally brushed against the keys. The sound was so soft, so gentle, that David almost didn't hear it. Just a whisper of middle C, barely audible in the empty theater. But to David, it might as well have been a thunderclap. David was just reaching for his cleaning supplies when he heard it, the soft click of a door closing somewhere behind him. He froze, his hand halfway to the mop bucket, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. Someone was in the theater. Panic shot through him like electricity. He wasn't supposed to be playing the piano. He was supposed to be working. What if it was his supervisor? What if someone complained? He needed this job. Lucy and Tommy needed him to have this job. He turned around slowly, trying to look casual, like he'd just been dusting the piano bench and definitely hadn't spent the last 20 minutes pouring his heart out through music. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing in the large space. 3 figures emerged from the shadows near the back of the theater. David's stomach dropped. He recognized one of them immediately. Jennifer Martinez, the theater's event coordinator. She was the one who hired him, the one who signed his paychecks. She was walking toward the stage with 2 other people David didn't recognize. This was it. He was going to get fired. How would he explain this to the kids? How would he make up? The lost income? His mind was already racing through worst-case scenarios when Jennifer started speaking. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet theater. "I didn't mean to interrupt. We just came back to pick up some sheet music I forgot earlier." David stood there like a deer in headlights, still holding his cleaning cloth. I was cleaning the piano," he stammered. "I'm sorry. I know I should have been working on the floors first. I'll get right back to—" "Wait." Jennifer held up her hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Were you just playing?" The question hung in the air between them. David felt his face getting hot. There was no point in lying. They'd obviously heard him. The only question was how much trouble he was in. "Yes," he said quietly. "I'm really sorry. It won't happen again. I used to play, and I haven't, in a long time, and I saw the piano and—" He was rambling now, making it worse. Jennifer looked at the 2 people with her, then back at David. "That was you playing Claire de Lune?" David nodded, feeling smaller by the second. "And that jazz piece after it? And everything else we heard from the lobby?" "Yes, ma'am. I know I shouldn't have. I was just—" "That was incredible." David blinked. "What?" Jennifer was smiling now, a big, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "That was absolutely incredible. We were in the lobby dealing with some paperwork when we heard this beautiful music. At first I thought someone had left a recording playing, but it was too perfect, too emotional. So we came in to see what was happening. One of the people with her stepped forward. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. "I'm Patricia Williams," she said, extending her hand. "I'm on the theater's board of directors. I've been coming to performances here for 15 years, and I have never heard anyone play that piano like that." The third person, a younger woman with a press badge hanging around her neck, was frantically digging through her purse. "I'm Rachel, from the Herald Tribune," she said. "I was here doing a story about the charity gala next week and, oh, I hope you don't mind, but I recorded some of it on my phone. It was just so beautiful I couldn't help myself." David felt like the world was spinning. "You recorded me?" Rachel looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry, I should have asked first. I can delete it if you want. It's just, when you were playing that Debussy piece, I started crying, right there in the lobby." I've never had that reaction to music before. Jennifer was looking at David with new eyes like she was seeing him for the first time. "How long have you been playing piano?" "Since I was a kid," David said, still trying to process what was happening. "I studied music in college, but that was a long time ago. I haven't really played in years." "Years?" Patricia looked shocked. "You play like that after not touching a piano for years?" David shrugged, not sure what to say. "I guess it's like riding a bike. You don't really forget." "Listen," Jennifer said, moving closer to the stage. "I have to ask you something, and please don't feel pressured to say yes. But we have a situation." David waited, his heart still racing. "Our featured performer for the charity gala canceled this morning. Family emergency. We've been scrambling all day trying to find someone to fill that slot. The gala is this Saturday night. We're expecting over 800 people, and the whole evening is built around having a musical centerpiece." David was shaking his head before she even finished. "Oh, no. No, I couldn't possibly. I don't perform. I mean, I used to, but not anymore. I'm just the janitor here." "You're not just anything," Patricia said firmly. "What we heard tonight was extraordinary. Raw talent like that doesn't come along very often." Rachel was nodding enthusiastically. "The emotion in your playing, it was like you were telling a story with every note. People would be moved to tears." "I don't have the right clothes," David said desperately. "I don't have sheet music. I haven't performed for an audience in over a decade. I wouldn't even know what to play." Jennifer held up her hands. "Slow down. Let's take this one step at a time. The theater has formal wear we use for productions. We can handle that. As for sheet music, if you can play like that from memory, I don't think repertoire is going to be a problem. But what if I mess up? What if I freeze? This is for charity. Important people will be there. I could ruin the whole evening." Patricia sat down in one of the front row seats, looking up at David with gentle eyes. "Can I tell you why this gala matters so much?" David nodded. "It's raising money for the Children's Hospital, specifically for their music therapy program. We're trying to buy instruments and hire therapists who use music to help sick kids heal. Kids who are fighting cancer, kids who've been in accidents, kids who need something beautiful in their lives when everything else feels scary and painful." David felt something twist in his chest. Kids fighting cancer. He thought about Anna's final months, about how music had been one of the few things that could still bring her comfort. "Last year," Patricia continued, "we raised enough money to buy keyboards for every room in the pediatric ward. The doctors say music helps with pain management, with emotional healing, with giving kids hope when they need it most." Jennifer stepped closer. "What we heard tonight, that kind of music could touch people's hearts. It could inspire them to give more generously than they planned." "You wouldn't just be performing? You'd be helping heal children?" David looked down at the piano keys. He thought about Lucy and Tommy, safe at home with Mrs. Rodriguez. He thought about other children who weren't safe, who weren't healthy, who were lying in hospital beds wishing for something to make them feel better. "I don't know if I'm good enough," he said quietly. "You are," Rachel said with absolute certainty. "I've covered hundreds of concerts for the paper. Trust me, you're good." "Enough." Jennifer pulled out her phone. "Look, I know this is a lot to process. You don't have to decide right now. But would you be willing to think about it? Maybe come in tomorrow night and play through some pieces? See how it feels with a few people listening?" David looked at the three women staring at him hopefully. A few hours ago, he'd been a janitor who hadn't touched a piano in 2 years. Now he was being asked to perform at the biggest charity event of the year. "What would I have to play?" he asked, and immediately regretted it because now he sounded like he was actually considering this crazy idea. Jennifer smiled. "Whatever moves you. What we heard tonight was perfect. Play pieces that mean something to you. Tell your story through the music." "How long would I need to play?" "Maybe 30 minutes? 3 or 4 pieces?" David thought about the music that lived in his heart. Clair de Lune for Anna, that jazz standard for his grandmother. Maybe something more contemporary, something hopeful for the future. "And you really think people would want to hear me play?" Patricia stood up and walked to the edge of the stage. "David, I've been involved with the arts community in this city for decades. I know talent when I hear it. More importantly, I know heart when I hear it. What you played tonight had both." Rachel was looking at her phone. "The recording I made, would you mind if I played just a little bit back for you? So you can hear what we heard?" Before David could object, she pressed play. The sound of piano music filled the theater. His piano music. The gentle opening notes of Clair de Lune floating through the air like they were being played by someone else entirely. David listened to himself play, really listened, for the first time in years. The recording wasn't perfect quality, but the emotion came through clearly. He could hear the love in every note, the longing, the hope, the sadness, the beauty. He could hear his story being told through Debussy's timeless melody. When the clip ended, the theater was silent except for the gentle hum of the ventilation system. "That's what we heard," Jennifer said softly. "That's what 800 people could hear on Saturday night." David looked at the piano, then at the three women, then back at the piano. His hands were trembling slightly, but not from fear. From possibility. "If I said yes," he said slowly. "And I'm not saying I am, but if I did, what happens next?" Jennifer's smile lit up the entire theater. "Next, we change some lives, starting with yours." David barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he could hear Jennifer's words echoing in his head. "Next, we change some lives, starting with yours." He'd agreed to come back Friday night for a private rehearsal. Just Jennifer, Patricia, and maybe 1 or 2 board members. Nothing formal. Just a chance to see how it felt playing for a small audience again. But now, lying in bed at 3 a.m., David was second-guessing everything. What had he been thinking? He was a janitor, not a concert pianist. He had kids to think about, responsibilities. What if he embarrassed himself? What if his hands froze up? What if he let everyone down? By morning, he'd almost talked himself out of it completely. "Dad, you look tired," Lucy said over breakfast, studying his face with the sharp eyes of an 8-year-old who noticed everything. "Just couldn't sleep, sweetheart," David said, pouring orange juice into her cup. "Sometimes grown-ups have trouble with that." Tommy was more interested in his cereal than his father's sleep schedule, but he looked up when David sat down with his coffee. "Are you sick, Dad?" "No, buddy. Just thinking about work stuff." That wasn't entirely a lie. David spent the whole day at the warehouse trying to focus on loading trucks, but his mind kept wandering back to the piano. His hands felt different somehow, more aware of themselves. During his lunch break, he found himself tapping out melodies on the table with his fingers. By the time he picked up the kids from after-school care, he'd made a decision. He was going to go to the rehearsal tonight, but only to prove to everyone that this was a terrible idea. He'd play a few songs, they'd realize he wasn't good enough, and life could go back to normal. Mrs. Rodriguez arrived right on time, as always. The kids were excited because she'd promised to teach them a card game her grandfather had taught her in Mexico. David kissed them goodbye and tried to ignore the way his stomach was doing somersaults. The drive to the theater felt longer than usual. David's hands were sweating on the steering wheel. He kept running through pieces in his head, trying to remember if he knew them well enough to play without mistakes. By the time he pulled into the parking lot, he was seriously considering turning around and going home. But Jennifer was already waiting by the front entrance, and she waved when she saw his car. "You came," she said as he walked up, sounding genuinely relieved. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," David admitted. Nerves are totally normal. Even professional musicians get nervous before big performances. "This isn't a big performance," David said quickly. "This is just trying something out, seeing if it works." Jennifer smiled. "Of course, no pressure at all." Inside, the theater looked different somehow. Smaller, more intimate. Someone had set up a few chairs near the front of the stage, and there were maybe 6 people sitting in them, chatting quietly. David recognized Patricia and Rachel from the night before. The others were strangers, just some board members and volunteers, Jennifer explained, noticing David looking at the small audience. "People who've been working on the gala. They're all friends." David nodded, but his mouth felt dry. Even 6 people felt like a lot after 2 years of playing 4. "No one. Take your time," Jennifer said. "Get comfortable. Play whatever feels right." David walked onto the stage, his footsteps echoing in the quiet theater. The piano looked exactly the same as it had the night before, but somehow it felt different now. Less like a friend and more like a test he might fail. He sat down at the bench and adjusted the height. His hands found their familiar position on the keys, but they felt stiff and uncertain. The small audience was watching him expectantly, waiting for something magical to happen. What if nothing magical happened? David started with scales, just to warm up his fingers. Simple exercises he'd learned as a child. The notes rang out clear and precise, but they felt mechanical, technical. There was no heart in them. He stopped and took a deep breath. This wasn't working. He felt like he was trying to force something that needed to happen naturally. "Take your time," Patricia called out from the audience. "There's no rush." David closed his eyes and tried to remember how he'd felt the night before. He'd been alone then, playing for Anna, playing for himself, playing just because the music needed to come out. He tried to find that feeling again. Slowly, his hands found their way to the opening notes of Clair de Lune. But something was different. The notes came out stilted and careful, like he was afraid to make a mistake. He could hear the audience listening, could feel their attention like weight on his shoulders. He stopped playing halfway through the first page. "I'm sorry," he said, looking up at the small group. "This isn't working. I thought I could do this. But I can't. I'm just a janitor who used to play piano. I'm not a performer." The audience was quiet for a moment. Then Patricia stood up. "David," she said gently, "can I tell you something?" He nodded. "My husband died 3 years ago. Cancer, like your wife. For months after his funeral, I couldn't listen to music. It hurt too much. Everything reminded me of him, of songs we used to dance to, pieces he loved to hear me play." David looked at her in surprise. "You play piano too?" "A little. Not like you. But enough to know that music isn't about being perfect. It's about being honest." She walked closer to the stage. "Last night when we heard you playing, I cried for the first time since Robert's funeral. Not sad tears, healing tears. Because your music told me I wasn't alone in my grief. That someone else understood what it felt like to lose everything and somehow keep going. David felt something shift in his chest. "You weren't playing for us last night," Patricia continued. "You were playing for her, for your wife, for yourself, for everyone who's ever lost someone they loved and wondered if they'd ever feel whole again." "That's what made it so beautiful," Rachel added from her seat. "It wasn't a performance. It was a conversation, a prayer, a love letter written in music." Jennifer stepped closer to the stage. "David, forget we're here. Close your eyes. If you need to, play like you did last night. Play for Anna." David looked down at the keys. Anna. If she were here right now, what would she want to hear? She'd want to hear their song. The jazz standard they'd danced to in that tiny practice room on their first real date. The one that made her laugh and spin around like she was in a movie. David's hands found the opening chord, and suddenly everything felt different. The stiffness melted away. His fingers remembered not just the notes, but the joy behind them, the love. The pure happiness of a young man trying to impress a beautiful girl and discovering she was already impressed just by his willingness to share something he loved. The melody bounced and swung, filling the theater with warmth and energy. David found himself smiling as he played, remembering the way Anna had moved to this music, the way she'd hummed along even when she didn't know the words. When he finished, the small audience erupted in applause. But more importantly, David felt like himself again. Not a janitor pretending to be a pianist, not a widowed father trying to be something he wasn't. Just David, telling his story through music the way he'd always done. That was it. Jennifer said, her eyes bright with excitement. "That's what we need for Saturday night." Over the next hour, David played 4 more pieces. Each one felt easier than the last. He played Clair de Lune again, and this time it soared with emotion instead of trembling with fear. He played a contemporary piece he'd learned years ago, something hopeful and uplifting. He even improvised a little, letting his hands wander into musical territory he hadn't explored in years. By the end of the rehearsal, everyone in the small audience was on their feet. David felt exhausted but exhilarated, like he'd just run a marathon and discovered he still remembered how to fly. "Saturday night," Jennifer said as people began to leave. 8 o'clock, 30 minutes, just play like you did tonight." David nodded, feeling something he hadn't felt in 2 years, excitement about the future. Saturday evening arrived faster than David expected. The theater was transformed. Instead of empty red seats, there were 800 people in evening gowns and tuxedos. The stage was lit with warm, golden light. Fresh flowers decorated every table. David stood backstage in a borrowed tuxedo, listening to the murmur of conversation from the audience. His hands weren't shaking anymore. His heart was racing, but it was the good kind of racing, the kind that came with anticipation instead of fear. Jennifer appeared at his elbow. "Ready?" "As ready as I'll ever be." "Remember what Patricia said. Play for Anna, play for yourself, play for everyone who needs to hear what you have to say." David walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. 800 people on their feet, welcoming him before he'd played a single note. He sat down at the piano bench and looked out at the sea of faces. "Good evening," he said into the microphone someone had placed near the piano. "My name is David, and 2 years ago, I thought my music died with my wife. Tonight, I want to share with you what I've learned about finding your way back to the things you love, even when you think they're gone forever." He began with the jazz standard, the song that had started everything with Anna. The audience was with him from the first note, swaying gently in their seats, smiling at the joy and the music. Then came Clair de Lune, and the theater went completely silent. David played it as a love letter to Anna, as a thank you for all the music they'd shared, as a promise that he would keep making beautiful things in her memory. By the time he finished his 30-minute set, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. The standing ovation lasted for 5 full minutes. People were crying, hugging each other, reaching for their wallets to make donations they hadn't planned on making. The charity gala raised more money that night than any fundraiser in the theater's history. But more importantly, David had found his way back to music, back to himself, back to a future that felt full of possibility instead of just survival. 3 months later, David quit 2 of his 3 jobs. He was teaching piano lessons in the afternoons, performing at private events on weekends, and the theater had hired him as their official accompanist. Lucy and Tommy were taking piano lessons now, too, filling their house with music for the first time since their mother died. The old upright piano in their living room wasn't just a place to stack mail anymore. It was where David played lullabies for his children, where he practiced pieces for upcoming performances, where he remembered that sometimes the most beautiful things in life come from the places where you thought everything was lost. Music had saved him. But really, he had saved himself by being brave enough to put his hands back on those keys and remember who he used to be.